5th of June 2018. I'm Hedvig and I'm here with Andrew Pawley. Andy, what do you have for us today?
Well, you've asked me to read a poem that I wrote more than 50 years ago.
Yes.
Called The Song of Noam, or Noam's poem.
And do you know why I've asked you to read this?
No?
Well, I think you may be underestimating what an interesting part of history this is. So even today, these original LSA meetings and the original publications and writings are, I think, for some people a bit legendary and filled with mystique. And you were there, and it's very interesting to get a sort of snapshot into what it was like.
Okay, well, I'll tell you a little bit about the background. This is 1964. It's Bloomington, Indiana, where the American Linguistic Institute was held. And among the speakers was Noam Chomsky, who gave 4 or 5 lectures on a Friday afternoon, 4 o'clock, to a packed crowd in the magnificent auditorium at Bloomington. And these were the lectures that were basically transformed into the publication of a year later of aspects of the theory of syntax. And it was a revelation to me, and I was emotionally disturbed by hearing Chomsky, because I was a young graduate student who had been trained in anthropological linguistics in the Bloomfieldian tradition. And here was this brilliant young professor from MIT who had come along and was challenging the foundations of structuralist linguistics. And he had a whole new way of talking about language that was completely different from anything that I'd learned. In fact, it was heretical in some ways. He talked about the native speaker's intuitions, and the task of linguistics is to get to uncover the intuitions of the native speaker, whereas I'd grown up in a very anti-mentalist tradition. And he had a whole new vocabulary talking about generative grammar, transformations, phrase structure rules, and competence and performance.
Do you think, I think it's hard for us today to realize what it is that was the shift, because for example, where I grew up in my department, we were mainly taught about the later years and the very specific bits of Chomsky school, but what you describe is a cultural shift that is wider and that encompasses things that I see as obvious and core to linguistics, like for example uncovering the native speaker's intuition. What do you think? It's maybe a bit hard for young people to understand what the shift actually was. So do you want to describe a little bit what was the thinking that you grew up with before that time?
Well, what we'd grown up with was the phoneme and the morpheme, morphology and phonemics. We didn't get much hadn't come to confront properly the challenges of describing syntax in the structuralist model. And Chomsky opened our eyes. I mean, his revolution was successful, and he changed the face of linguistics. But yes, it was a shock to us to be confronted with this totally new language, a new way of looking at syntactic analysis. So I was moved after I'd heard a couple of lectures. I retired to my bedroom one night and wrote down this poem. Shall I read it to you?
Yes, please.
The Song of Noam, or Noam's poem. I introduced it as the revelations of the prophet Noam at the Holy Fount of Learning, Bloomington, Indiana, in the year 7 AC. AC being after Chomsky, or after the publication of Syntactic Structures, as heard and written down by one of his disciples.
It's truly epic.
I will sing you a song of the thoughts I have thought. To this end alone I have come. Let the man of the hour in his moment of power state his achievements in sum. My song is an infinite song of endeavours in scope quite Homeric, of conceptual tools, operational rules, of concepts you may find esoteric. I grew weary of theory that deals with the corpus, that's finite and bounded and small. I proved in my thesis, as I pulled it to pieces, many things it can't handle at all. A theory is no theory that can't generate an active and passive relation. Constituent analysis is subject to paralysis when faced with transforms like negation. It's a question of power in handling strings and adequate evaluation. If S1 is grammatic, then I must be emphatic. S2 is the right transformation. My string is a string of infinite length. My nodes subdivide into pairs. I concatenate symbols with a mind sharp and nimble. I have taken the world unawares. There are very deep structures to some of my strings, structures that no one has seen. They're the wondrous fruition of my intuition, structures both clean and obscene. That's a bit weak. And the next verse is probably the one, the key one. The speech of a man may be finite in span. In performing he stutters and stammers. But don't be misled. It's what's in his head that's the subject of non-trivial grammars. My kernels appear in most of the journals. My trees can be seen in their pages. No transformations, but by my operations, will be permitted for ages and ages.
That's beautiful. That's wonderful.
It seems very dated now.
I don't think so at all.
The Chomskyian paradigm has changed, is itself been through several metamorphoses since then. And even Chomskyites probably won't recognize some of the language.
Looking at this and hearing you read it as well, I think it sounds... What is the thing that you think is the most outdated bit? Because to my ears, maybe I didn't think very deeply about it yet. It sounded fairly standard. Infinite strings and native speakers' heads and deep structures.
Well, it's just that Chomsky has moved on to universal grammar and the notion that that much of universal grammar is innate, and he's no longer concerned with the details of syntactic analysis of the generative grammars of particular languages. He's after universals.
My understanding is also that during his research, his perception of what is universal grammar has slowly whittled down to less and less particular structures. And now we're mainly left with recursion. Which...
Move alpha.
Yeah, that doesn't...
Minimalism.
Yeah.
So Chomsky's own interests have changed. And I'm not close enough to the generative schools to know how much of this language is still in vogue. But when I occasionally read regenerative articles, I don't see much of this anymore.
What do you think at the time in 1964, did anyone in the rest of the academia or in the general public pay any attention to this shift in linguistics?
I think it was big in psychology, experimental psychology. Chomsky wrote a famous review of B.F. Skinner's book about behaviorism, and it was a devastating critique. And lots of psychologists were sympathetic to Chomsky's critique and began to conduct experiments trying to uncover the mental underpinnings of the correlates of generative grammar, phrase structure rules and transformations, and they would do experiments which would time people doing passive transformations from active prototypes and draw to conclusions as to the psychological reality of rules of grammar.
So the idea being that if there is an underlying universal structure, then people, when they have to create an utterance that involves more transformation, more modifications to the underlying simpler universal structure, it takes them longer time. And therefore, in the experiment, when they're asked to do a passive clause instead of an active, when they have to say the man was hit instead of I hit the man, that would take them longer time, and that would be a proof of them having to do a movement.
Yeah, I think that's the general idea. Chomsky had the notion of kernel sentences or base structures, and deep. A little bit later came deep structure and surface structure. And anyway, it also, Chomsky was such a brilliant guy, and that his work became quite influential, I think, in some domains of philosophy. And he soon, of course, the other string to his bow was as a political analyst and commentator, and he became a foremost critic of American policies, foreign policies, and so on, and became a public intellectual of great importance.
Do you think that, how was that perceived in the world of linguistics? Did that go hand in hand, or did people see it as a totally separate endeavor?
I think many linguists were sympathetic to Chomsky's political views, not all, but I think they regarded it as pretty separate.
Do you think it was possible for someone to be politically quite a conservative person, but academically be accepted into Chomsky's linguistic school? Is that a...
I don't really know.
No. That's fair.
I don't think the generalists were intolerant of all of political views that were contrary to those of Chomsky. But most of Chomsky's linguistic disciples would have probably had shared some of his political opinions.
By the sounds of this poem and other things that I've heard about him, he sounds like, especially in his early years, he was a very charismatic leader of sorts.
Yes, attending his lectures on Friday afternoons at the Linguistic Institute was like, I imagine, listening to the Sermon on the Mount. It was a packed auditorium, hundreds of people, nuns and priests sitting in the aisles.
Wow.
And you could hear a pin drop. He wasn't a great orator in the sense of declaiming loudly. He was quite quiet and understated, but the power of what he was saying was mesmerizing.
What do you think it was? Do you think he was part of a new wave, or was he truly that unique? Was he a particularly good, vocalizer of something that was already in the zeitgeist? Or was he truly a unique inventor of this?
I think he was pretty much a unique inventor. Looking back, you can see some of the groundwork, some of the fundamentals of generative grammar were already latent in structuralist linguistics. His teacher was Zelig Harris, a grammarian of some distinction, but he hadn't formulated transformational grammar, but he was doing things that you could see were related to Chomsky's innovations, and the notion of generative grammar, a grammar that was an algorithm that would predict all and only the possible sentences of a language.
Yeah.
Was, I think, implicit in some of the structuralist linguistics of the time, but Chomsky articulated it much more clearly and forcefully.
That then sounds like he was not an entirely unique inventor. He was partially an unusually good person to articulate something that maybe was already a bit present.
Yes, well, he brought the language of mathematics, made it much more central, talking about generative generative grammar as an algorithm for specifying all and only the languages, and strings and concatenations and stuff. So that kind of language hadn't been heard in linguistics before.
And what do you personally think now? There's been many years since this event, and you have learned a lot about a lot of different languages that are quite different from... I'm assuming I'm right in saying that a lot of the early transformational grammar was mainly influenced by Western European languages, probably mainly English. And now that you have learned so much more about especially Austronesian languages, what is it? Do you think there's anything that still says something profound from the generative school?
Well, I was profoundly affected by Chomsky, even though I was upset at having everything I'd learned being questioned. So I went back to Auckland, where I got my first job in the Department of Anthropology. We taught linguistics to anthropology students, many of whom were interested in, some of whom were interested in doing grammars of languages of the Pacific. We had a nice big grant which funded fieldwork on different Polynesian languages. And I encouraged my students to write generative grammars. I became a Chomskyite, not a rabid Chomskyite, but an enthusiastic one. And several grammars were churned out of languages of Polynesia. I was working on a Papuan language of New Guinea, and I didn't see any difference between applying generative grammar methods and conceptual framework to these exotic languages as opposed to applying them to European languages.
Did you encounter any problems though?
Only the same problems that you encounter in English. I think in choosing between alternative analyses, Chomsky drew our attention to evaluation metrics, mostly basically boiling down to simplicity and economy.
Occam's razor.
Occam's razor, yeah, which was really already, I think, tacitly part of linguistics. You always chose you preferred the simplest explanation.
Do you think it's possible that today, when grammar writers go out into the field and describe a language, a lot of people will say, "Oh, I'm not using a framework at all. I'm model free. I'm framework free. I am only using the bare bones of linguistics, terminology and tools." And then they go out and they describe a language and they come back. Do you think it's possible that, in fact, they are using a framework similarly to what you were doing? Because some of the tools you describe are probably now just in the general toolbox. They're not even thought of as generative.
Yes, well, this question has been discussed at some length, and Bob Dixon, what does he talk about?
Basic linguistic theory.
Basic linguistic theory, yes.
Yeah.
Which is really the things that structural linguists and generativists pretty much agree on. And so that part of that's still highly theoretical. I mean, it involves making certain assumptions about the nature of language.
Indeed.
So it's impossible to go out and to make sense of the world without a theory. That's the nature of human thought in general. We carry with us a whole bunch of preconceptions and perceptions that we have acquired that we use to make sense of the world.
Indeed. No, I fully agree. I think that it's so Matthew Dreyer and Bob Dixon have formulated something they call basic linguistic theory, right? Which is sort of writing down the assumptions that we all have but never say is the theory, and say these are actually regular assumptions that we apply, and we should be aware of the assumptions that we are making. And I think that's really valuable and good to acknowledge. The difference though maybe between the grammars that you encouraged your students to write in Auckland all those years ago is that sometimes they're written in a very particular jargon and with particular notation and formal rules that can be a bit inaccessible to read, if I'm not being too bold in my critique.
No, you're quite right. The grammars that we wrote then are largely unintelligible to readers these days. A good example of that was Stan Staros's Lexicase, where he was very keen Chomskyian, but he was wanting to restrict the power of transformations. So he said grammar grows out of the barrel of the lexicon. In many ways, it's anticipating what Chomsky himself said in the 1970s. And he made all his students write these highly formal, extremely explicit, nothing could be left to the imagination. You had to spell out in your formulae exactly what claims you were making. The problem was that the notation was so complex and that nobody could read these days nobody would read a grammar written in the Lexicase framework.
Yeah. No, I haven't tried that framework, but I've tried reading what's it called, syntagmatic, and a couple of other styles of grammar, and it is quite hard, and I often feel like I'm missing out on valuable information. I found myself having to look up the local generativist scholar in wherever department I am and ask them to please help me translate, because I think there's valuable information in there. But I'm struggling getting it out.
As Lebov pointed out, generative grammar is a very good discovery procedure. It forces you to ask questions about grammatical possibilities, and you have to keep discovering data that's going to allow you to fill in gaps in your coverage, because you have a fully explicit methodology.
Yeah.
So I think that was a very valuable contribution of Chomsky's, but it's not something that concerns him these days, as far as I know.
The other day I saw a news bit saying that Chomsky has been asked to comment on the existence of universal grammar in non-human aliens. And I think he said something to the effect of it's possible that they have universal grammar, but I think he meant the weak, basically just recursion. And if that's all that UG is, then okay, aliens can have it. That doesn't sound like a very substantial, claim to me.
Well, I don't know. We share, all of us linguists share a passion for language, and linguistic analysis, which must seem rather strange to the man and woman in the street. We regard language as, of course, by far the most important invention in the history of evolution, the evolution of the human species. It's something that everybody else takes for granted, and people will tell you, what's the most important invention in human history? Or fire, or something like that.
Wheel.
Forgetting that without language we just wouldn't have the kind of society and the technology that we've evolved.
And what do you think that the kind of linguistic endeavor that's been going on the past, 150 years with Bloomfield and Saussure and Chomsky and all these great leaders and all the people and things in between, what do you think is the most interesting and valuable thing we've learned?
Well, that's a hard one. For beyond linguistics, the question is whether our view of the world is shaped by the languages we speak, and that human thought is not pre-linguistic but dependent in some sense on the categories that the language has institutionalized. So that's one interesting implication of result from, not a result, but an endeavour that has popular, that linguists have engaged in, that has more general interest.
So this is the idea that the language you grew up with and learn natively in your early years will form the way you classify and see the world, such that you can never really get away from it, and you can never have a universal neutral way of viewing the world. And probably, I think this theory also suggests that if you learn language later in life, you're very unlikely to acquire that world view.
Not perfectly anyway.
No. So the most interesting examples I've heard of this is both the experiments on relative or absolute direction, like whether or not you view the world organized primarily in left and right with you in the center, or whether you are more focused on north and south and west and east and down and up river. There's been some experience to show that people that depending on which system is predominant in their language, they will perceive the world a bit differently. The other example is, I think, gender categories, with the experiment famously is it German and Spanish with the bridge and the key. Mm-hmm. Do you remember this?
Mm-hmm.
So in one of the languages, bridge happens to be masculine and the other happens to be feminine, and the other way around with key. And when you ask people to list adjectives with these two words, the ones that have the masculine gender on bridge will start listing different kinds of adjectives than the one that have feminine, and the other way with key. The question is, if that's true, how do these relatively probably small biases actually affect our overall worldview? Are these just little pebbles that just, slightly change our worldview, or are these actually massively different shifts? So I just wanted to expand so that I have some examples.
Also, there's been quite a lot of work on color categories.
Yes.
But Hockett used to make the point that our language doesn't imprison us totally, but it constrains us, so it makes us biases towards perceiving certain the world in certain ways. It's not that we can't with effort use language itself to reformulate and to break out of this straitjacket, but nevertheless the categories that language ready-made categories that language provides for us directs and constrains our thinking.
Well, there's a lot of recent research that focuses on the idea of the small biases, not these kinds of biases, but other sort of, if you have a large enough population, even small biases can accumulate over time, such that it might affect your culture, or it might affect your language. This is the idea that, for example, Dan Dediu discusses in their paper on some populations being genetically slightly more sensitive to tone, mm-hmm. and therefore being more likely to use tone as a phonemic contrast in their language. So the contrast, the sensitivity to tone is actually quite small, but it's just the idea that as it accumulates, it builds up to a massive effect. Never mind. But
I've just remembered one thing I didn't talk about earlier. As I began to, partly as a result of learning various languages in the Pacific, tackling the task of learning them with varying degrees of success, it became obvious to me that mastery of idiomatic control of a language depends very largely on not knowing just the rules of grammar, but the speech formulas, the multi-word units and constructions that we use to say particular things. And that was when I sent my paper about that I wrote with my mum, called Two Puzzles for Linguistic Theory, Native-like Selection and Native-like Fluency. I sent it to Chomsky, and he very politely said it was a very plausible thing.
Yeah, which is sort of preempting construction grammar in a sense, which is a
Yes.
modern theory. Yeah.
Well, construction grammar was starting to emerge with work of Fillmore and a bit later Lakoff in the late 70s. And at the same time, my mother and I were developing independently something that was essentially the same thing. We spoke of lexicalized sentence stems and speech formulas.
And this was influenced by your mother's work as a teacher, wasn't it?
Yes, she was interested in the power of language, its power of spoken language as opposed to written language, and what gave the spoken language its vitality.
Mm.
And you have doing things with words. So philosophers of language at the same time were like Austin and Searle were touching on the same thing, or not exactly the same thing, but concerned with the power of language.
You truly have a great sensitivity to the zeitgeist, Andy.
To the what?
To the zeitgeist. You're preempting construction grammar and performativity all at the same time.
Yes, I was always too ahead of my time in an unfortunate way.
What do you think is the next thing in that case? If you're so good at having the finger in the air and feeling where the current is moving, what do you think is the next thing?
I don't know. I'm too old to have any new ideas anymore.
Oh, I doubt that.
I'm still trying to describe the languages that I've gathered a lot of data on over the years, and I've become much more of a humdrum descriptive linguist than a theoretician in recent years.
Well, I still enjoy these conversations with you because you always have a good way of explaining it, and you always know all the papers I should be reading and all the things. And probably, similarly to other teachers I've had, you've probably already written the paper on the thing I just thought of yesterday. So...
You're speaking in generalities, or there's something that you did write yesterday?
No, it's not something I did think of yesterday, but I find myself sometimes thinking in similar... Perhaps that is just the zeitgeist, that we're all being, pushed and pulled in certain directions, and we all come down the same thought paths. And if you just sit on those thought paths for long enough, you may often arrive at similar ideas. I think, for example, the work you did with your mother about formulaic language is very interesting, and something I wish I could get I haven't gotten a hold of that paper about you with your mother, but I'd like to.
Oh, I'm happy to give you a copy. Yes, but I guess as the years roll by, you realise that theories come and go, but that what's most important for posterity is to have the data. And you can't have pure data. It has to be interpreted in terms of some kind of theoretical framework, but you use a framework that's not going to be inaccessible, make your data inaccessible to later generations. So I've been concentrating on dictionaries, but my dictionaries include a lot of phraseology, and ideally I would like to do dictionaries that dealt with speech acts and social context, intonation, much broader range of information than we normally put in dictionaries. We need to document our not going to be around probably in a century or two, in some cases within a generation or two. So we have a responsibility.
Indeed.
To record these in as rich in using in as rich a way as possible.
Yeah. Do you think that funding of linguistic research should be geared even more towards documentation and description than it is today?
Well, it's been a wonderful thing over the last 20 years or so to see funding agencies devote or come into being, which will support documentation. I'd like to see a little more funding for the actual, not just the gathering of the data and building up a corpus, but in the actual completion of dictionaries and grammars that will make these corpora more readily available to linguists and to other interested people down in subsequent generations.
The other week on Talk to Talk, we had on an editor from dictionary.com, and she was talking about what it's like to create a dictionary for, well, English, a large language where a lot of people have a lot of opinions and might contest certain meanings. So, for example, she was discussing the dictionary entry for feminism and how they had discussions about what definitions to include, whether or not to acknowledge that some people use it derogatorily to mean something like man-hater, or whether they should stick to what they thought was the more common or more widely applicable definition. Do you think that anything like that comes into play when you edit dictionaries for small languages?
Well, there's variation in between speakers of a language in their understanding of the meanings of certain words in every language. And ideally the dictionaries should record this variation. So, for example, take a word like fish in English. If you ask people what sort of animals the fish are, they will disagree as to whether eels are fish, whether sharks are fish, stingrays are fish. Dolphins? Whether whales and dolphins are fish, and even whether jellyfish and crayfish are fish.
Mm-hmm.
I've done work with classes in that we've done questionnaires asking hundreds of people for their definitions, and there's considerable variation. But if you look up dictionaries, many of them don't reflect this variation. Another good one is shellfish. In America, shellfish include crayfish, crabs, prawns.
Oh, right. Yeah.
In New Zealand, where I grew up, nobody would dream of calling a crayfish
a shellfish.
A shellfish. It's just univowels and bivalves.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think in Swedish we don't even have a word that's shellfish, I think. What would we say? No. I shouldn't say anything. I've forgotten too much of my Swedish and I haven't eaten shellfish since I was 10, so I'm not a good candidate. Anyway,
dictionaries tend not to record this variation. Another favorite example of mine is instep. English speakers disagree as to what the instep is. It's a part of your foot.
Oh, the hole, the ball, the hole, the valve.
Most people think that the instep is the hollow part between the toes and the heel, underneath the foot. But foot professionals and shoemakers and traditionally people the instep is the top of the foot.
Oh.
Or the cross section of the top, from the top of the foot through.
Oh. Well, I guess that a large hollow bit of the foot would mean a high instep.
The instep is the part that you have to slip into a shoe. You're stepping into the shoe.
Oh, this bit. Oh, we're touching our feet. Okay.
And again, English dictionaries tend not to record this variation.
That's funny. I hadn't thought of that. I think in Swedish we would call it like a valve, like a. Again, I'm not very good at hyper-specific Swedish words anymore. Fotvalv. Yeah, valve. Like a valve in a anywhere. In a
valve.
building. An arch.
Oh, an arch. Yes.
Arch.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, the arch of the foot is the instep.
Yeah. Yeah. That's easier.
But anyway, there are far more politically loaded words that are very, very. Of course, people use words like communist and Marxist.
Yes.
As
cultural Marxist.
As
derogatory
terms, and it's a huge task for the lexicographer to deal with variation, but ideally we should strive harder than we do.
Did you ever have any political thing like this in Kalam? Was there ever a word that people in the community were in deep disagreement on?
I can't think offhand of anything.
No, it's all right. All right, I think unless there's anything else you want to talk about, maybe we should wrap it up.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed the chat.
Yes, thank you. I enjoyed this very much. Just going to make sure...